I'm going to get it started with question number one, and I'm going to try and do this pretty quickly. The price you pay for an iTunes download is a private cost. The benefit that your neighbor receives from hearing your good music taste is an external benefit. When the neighbor dislikes your music taste, that's an external cost. When you receive positivity and pleasure from your iTunes download, that's a private benefit. When you buy a security system, that's a private cost. When you enjoy safety because of your security system, that's a private benefit. When a crime occurs to your neighbor who doesn't have a security system, that's an external cost. But when your neighbor benefits from you just having a security system, that's an external benefit. With question number two, SUVs have an external cost of $10,000, so we should tax them. Fashionable clothes have a cost of $400, so we should also tax them. But ideas have a benefit of $999 million, so we should definitely subsidize them. And for the bonus part of question number two, an example of how that will work with clothes is the cost of fast fashion. Fashionable clothes are usually made in places that violate tons of human rights violations. And in one situation in Bangladesh at the Rana Plaza, the building collapsed because it wasn't adequately handled and violated so many things and had people packed in it. And also, fast fashion contributes to a lot of environmental waste. So there is a cost to that very fashionable looking dress. With question number three, in A, Coe's law applies because the neighbor can just pay more than the cost it takes to remove that shrub, and the neighbor benefits in exchange. With B, there is no externality because the neighbor is just annoyed. There's no financial impact. And with C, while there is an ecological nightmare happening, there's no comment on how the families who live on the banks are benefited, so there isn't really a true externality. Obviously, you could think about the poor fish. But then in part D, with a fishery 1 mile downstream, there is definitely, Coe's law definitely applies, and in that situation, the electric plant could pay the fishery for the loss of fish, or the fishery could pay for them to produce a little less output, so a few more fish stay alive so they can make more money. So there is room for exchange.
Question 4, example A. Essentially, my answer to this would be it would depend on the goal. If the purpose is to eliminate auto industry pollution, this would be effective since SUVs are the biggest emitter of pollutants out of the automobile industry. If this was pollution as a whole, however, it would not be that effective. Essentially, people would just stop buying cars, or the quality of the cars would go down, and it would just make problems worse for people. A better opportunity would be to incentivize electric vehicles or subsidize the purchasing of electric vehicles if that was for the whole, and even somewhat so for the auto industry. But if it would actually hit the mark if it was just for the auto industry, since people would go buy other cars, or they would walk, or they would take public transportation instead of buying SUVs. So for example B, I don't think raising the property tax would solve the issue. I think if you raise the property tax on the liquor store owner isn't going to be able to hire more employees to work at the liquor store. That's going to leave 2 or 4 more people without jobs in that community, which they might then fall into doing unruly behavior and being part of the problem and not part of the solution. I think the better example would be to subsidize youth programs, such as ways to get kids more involved in academics or in sports programs, subsidized government or local programs so that kids have an opportunity to go get those jobs later in life, but also go and get an education, just fill their time doing something good and beneficial. For example, C, although this is arbitrary and there are thousands of different fashions that could be deemed ugly, for the purpose of destroying the bell-bottom industry, this would definitely hit the mark on it. If there's a high tax on bell-bottom jeans, more individuals would start buying different jeans. They'd buy straight jeans, they'd buy skinny jeans. As the price went up, so demand would go down. So essentially, less people would buy these jeans because there are so many other substitutes and there's so many other things to do. Finally, with example D, even though this would be effective, in the sense that the tax would be effective. Directors would not want to pay increased fees for profanities. It's an infringement on the rights of free speech. But I think a better program would be similar to the program from the EPA with like pollution permits, um, perhaps a profanity permit system. So as you can see now, like HBO has obviously allowed more profanity in its shows than Disney Channel shows, but also that is because they cater to different audiences. In the situation where this happened, it would be more intelligent and more efficient to give permits or something like the sort to shows that deal with mature materials. Question 5A and 5B. And of course, the answer to this comes down to the difference between flexibility and constraint. It would be better to allow Maxicon to come out with a detailed plan that fits the strengths of the factory, that fits the strengths of the company command system, and they can say, we are going to eliminate 25% of emissions this way, this way. So flexibility in this case would give Maxicon the ability to eliminate more external costs than a constraint on part B. This would depend on the highest producers, because essentially if all tradable permits are consolidated in one company, then that company has no incentive to trade, then they're not going to trade. So essentially the entire system of tradable permits just becomes inefficient. And then the companies who are highest producing pollution will just keep on producing pollution at a high rate. So if Maxicon is one of those high producers, they're just going to use all of the tradable permits and produce at a high rate, and nothing's really going to get done. If they're one of the lower ones, they're going to sell all of their permits off. But that's dependent on how much pollution Maxicon creates.
Question 6. The firms would prefer to offer its employees free flu shots because they're doing something called internalizing the externalities of the flu shot. What this means is that the firms would not be affected by due to sick days from the workers, and also there are more external benefits in a way that other people will not be getting sick due to one worker not being able to buy a flu shot. Question 11. Economically, this statement is incorrect because with the example from chapter 10 of modern physics about the use of antibiotics, and basically the more antibiotics people use, the stronger the bacteria get, and therefore we're polluting the environment with stronger bacteria. So because we're using antibiotics and it's necessary to use the antibiotics to stop the spread of the bacteria, we're in a way we're polluting the environment with stronger bacteria. Therefore, the environment isn't really priceless. There's an effect on the environment.
So question 8 asks about the external cost of romance novels on men. So to illustrate in the figure, the blue arrow and blue line represent the shift in the external cost from the private cost. And then the yellow triangle in the figure illustrates the deadweight loss from the externality before a tax or other solution is imposed. So this is just the triangle from the private cost to the social cost. So if the government decides to compensate by putting a tax on romance novels, should the tax be high enough to stop everyone from reading the novels? I said no, because eliminating the market for novels would only hurt the economy by costing producers their money and costing customers a good they desire. So the tax should really just be high enough to sync the market equilibrium with the efficient equilibrium. And I demonstrated this with the orange arrow, which shows how the tax should be raised up to the external cost line. So question E asks, as long as the government spends money efficiently, does it matter what the government spends the money from the romance novel tax on? So the government does not need to spend the tax money on fixing the harmful social effects of romance novels, but it might be a good idea if they want to fix this problem permanently. So question 9 asks, a government is torn between selling annual pollution allowances and setting an annual pollution tax. So it's the same price and quantity either way. So which one would raise more revenue? So I said both would raise exactly the same amount of revenue, because the price that customers are willing to pay for pollution is the same as the tax they would have to pay either way. So the government makes the same amount